So, welcome to Made to Create, the second part of Lesson 3, which is watercolor techniques. I'm going to hold up the paper. I would like you to pause after I show you this. Take your next sheet of watercolor paper. Once again, mark it into 4 quadrants. If you'd like to pause and use a ruler to do that, that would be fine. And I want you to number this second section, number 5, number 6, number 7, and number 8. Number 5 is going to be stippling, S-T-I-P-P-L-I-N-G. All right? Number 6 is going to be shading. So I'd like you to draw one small circle here that we're going to shade. And in the rest of this area, we're going to be pushing the brush. It's another watercolor technique, pushing the brush. So in number 6, we're going to do pushing the brush and shading. Number 7 will be wet paint onto wet paper. And number 8 will be Da Vinci fingers, is what I call it, and using your masking fluid. So if your masking fluid is not available to you right now, pause also and get your masking fluid and come back. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is use the masking fluid in quadrant number 8 because masking fluid is so wonderful. It holds the white paper, or if you painted blue and use masking over it, whatever you paint with masking fluid, underneath is going to stay pristine. So you have a fine line masking tool where you're going to be taking the masking fluid out of a needle. Then later I'm going to use, for some people that want to do more masking projects, I'll be actually painting with masking fluid. But for this technique, we're going to be using this little needle-sized line. Now I want to tell you, my masking fluid is old and bubbly, yours is new. I'm going to have some mistakes here with my masking fluid, and that's okay, but I need to get it on there first because it needs to dry. And I don't want to paint over wet masking fluid. So I'm just going to take my masking fluid, I'm going to make a couple of diagonal lines, and I'm going to do some cross-hatching with other diagonal lines. So I'm doing that on this half of the paper, and over here is going to be Da Vinci fingers. Okay, let's go to stippling. The thing about these techniques that's so awesome is once you learn them, you're going to be looking at paintings and go, oh my gosh, that's dry brush, or oh, he blended, that's wet paint into wet paint. And the stippling, you're going to recognize it forever now in paintings when you're painting. Let me show you what stippling is. Stippling is different than a brush stroke. You are dabbing or jabbing. You do not pull the brush across the paper. You poke or lay your brush down, almost like you're printmaking with your brush. And let me show you what I'm talking about. So I'm going to stipple with green right now, and that, just touching the paper lightly, I'm stippling with green. Now I could stipple with the full brush like this. Now think about it. A school of fish, raindrops falling through the air, freckles on a child's face, white spots on a fawn, a field of flowers where the flowers are way in the distance, stippling. Maybe even flower petals, stippling. Now I'm switching color, cleaning my brush, making sure that I'm adding lots of water to my paint, because this is watercolor, so every now and then you're going to need, and I will test it again to make sure that's pretty opaque, friends. This is too dark. You can see I just tested the yellow. Sometimes I'm going to want it that dark, but I need to add more water right now to my yellow. I want it to be lighter. Okay, I'm going to try stippling by pushing my brush down in one place. Now I'm going to try stippling over those green wet dots. Some of the yellow is not touching the green, and some of the yellow is touching the green. Now you can just imagine, again, a field of spring coming to life using stippling. So stippling is awesome. I'm going to say to you right now, turn off the video and do some stippling just in this quadrant and see what you come up with. You don't have to use yellow and green. Use any colors you want. By the way, if you bought cakes of watercolor, I'd recommend not using black at all with these lessons until the very end. While we're learning these techniques, black is a very powerful color and can take over all your other colors, so hold off on the black, okay? All right, now pushing the brush. Really a lot like stippling. It is stippling, except I'm going a little further. I'm going to take my brush and kind of push for a stroke. It's like in between stippling and a stroke. Pushing the brush, but still kind of dabbing. Now watch this. This is going to be really fun. I'm going to push blue onto that green. So I've cleaned my brush. I've loaded it with blue. Now I'm going to push my brush onto that green. The scales of a fish or a mermaid. I've still got kind of an oval shape of the stipple, but the pushing makes it blend a bit. And if I let that dry and I stippled a color on top of that, or glaze, that would be painting over another color, what an effect I could achieve. So there is pushing the brush. Now we're going to take this circle and I'm going to teach you a little bit about shading. And this time is one of the times I'm going to say, let's get a nice, rich, intense, opaque watercolor to start with. So I'm going to start with a red. I'm going to add just a little bit of water, but I'm going to test it and see. I want a nice, rich red. You know what? I want to add a little more paint. I want it to be a little bit, yes. So I'm going to take my circle here, and I'm going to try to show light as if light from a spotlight or sun is shining on this side of the circle, and over here is the darker, more shadowed, not in the direct light part of the circle. But I'm going to do that by first getting a very intense red in the darker area that's in the shadows. Now I'm going to come around, take my brush and clean it just a little bit, but still not completely clean. Hold on, it's completely clean. That's okay. I'm going to start moving. Look what's happening. See the lighter color? I'm moving. Really, it's kind of wet into wet of the same color. And blending so that I have a lighter color here, just like a spotlight of sunshine in that area. So here's light hitting here, a shadow over here, and if I wanted to make it even more intense, I could take my paper towel, wrap it around my finger, and just touch one area of sparkling light. So there is shading with the one same color of watercolor, not using any black, and you can see the feeling of light is hitting that, almost like a ball with sun, and then this is out of the direct sunlight. Okay, now we're going to do wet paint on wet paper. So how would you do that? You would start out with applying, and I am actually thinking to myself, as I dip my brush into the clean water, I am pushing the water into the fibers of the paper. I'm trying to get the water to push in, literally into the paper. Now I'm going to do a second coat because I want this to be incredibly wet. Do you know that some artists, when they work, they get really high quality paper that can take a beating? We're talking paper that's like $10 a sheet. They submerge it in water for a few hours. They bring it out. It's such well-made paper. It doesn't fall apart. They dab it dry, and then they paint with this wet paint on wet, saturated paper. And the effects are exquisite. And we're going to do a little bit of a mock-up of doing wet paint on wet paper. Not quite to that extent of the paper's completely saturated. I just did 3 coats. I'm going to do one more coat, and I'm really pushing that water into the fibers of the paper, okay? Now I'm going to take this and look this side, kind of pick up any pools, because this is really fun. This is really fun. I'm going to take a blue. I'm going to test it. It's pretty dark, but it's still somewhat transparent. And I'm going to take the tip of my brush like a ballerina's foot and just kind of draw a line like an S-curve or a snake. And the effect is just wonderful. Look at that. It's pooling and spreading and feeding into that wet paper. So let me switch colors because that'll be a blast. A green that I've mixed up with yellow and blue. Now I've got this nice green going here. Just a beautiful effect, almost like water, an underwater picture. You can almost see the seaweed coming up through the water, or just a wonderful wild abstract piece. So let me get a little bit of yellow for the grand finale. And this time, instead of dragging it through, I'm just going to do a little bit of pushing and stippling. I want my yellow to be a little darker because the paper's okay. We'll just see the effect of that. And I know what I want to do. One more thing, because it'll be fun if this really spreads. I'm going to take some purple, mixing red and blue, and I'm just going to dab purple dots. Really stippling now, but look at the effect on that wet paper. So much fun. You can even see doing flowers like this and letting it dry, and then once it's dry, wet paint over dry paper, wet paint over dry paint. You could draw in stems and leaves. So there you go. That's wet paint and wet paper. And finally, here's our wonderful masking fluid. I'm going to start, I'm just going to paint a straight color on that because I want to also get to the Da Vinci fingers and then take this off. So I'm going, now you're looking saying, oh, I see, I'm switching colors here. I see the lines from the stippling, from the masking fluid. But what is that going to show up like later? Well, that's going to rub right off. Oops, it's coming off on my brush. Okay. I'll come back to that. I was just playing with color there. Now, Da Vinci fingers is me experimenting. I just wanted you to know that I just read, I did a little research on Da Vinci. He was one of my Lily Grant things. He would paint with his fingers a lot. He would literally go in there if he wanted things to smudge and work and smooth out. And I tried it with watercolor, and I really like it. So I'm just showing you something I made up for my own technique by reading about Da Vinci and his technique. Is there, and I put a little purple in there. I really like Da Vinci fingers. Thank you, Leonardo. And now I'm going to add a little bit of pure crimson red on top of that and see what it works like. Oh, yeah. And I could even just play. It's almost finger painting. I know it is. Now let that dry and let me see what I could do on top of that later. Okay. I'm going to go in and peel this off. No, I think I'm going to have to tell you, since we don't have time in this video, once all of this dries, all you have to do with your masking fluid is take it off. But you want it to be completely dry because this is what you'll see. You'll see pure white lines. Masking fluid is so exciting because it gives you a pristine, clean underline beneath your color. Okay, that's it for watercolor techniques, and I'll see you at lesson number 4.